We are in this series, Explore God, and I think it really is a very important series because what we're doing is we are processing through 7 of the biggest questions in regards to God, faith, and Christianity. And the reason I think that this is important is, first of all, because everybody has questions. Everybody does. Nobody has all of the answers. It doesn't matter if you're a Christian, not a Christian. It doesn't matter if you've been a Christian for years and years and years and years. Everybody has questions. Everybody wrestles with doubt along the way, or at least has those doubts. The danger is that because of fear, we avoid dealing with the questions. And maybe it's a fear that we won't find the answer. Maybe it's a fear that we'll find an answer that's different than what we want it to be. But for all sorts of fear reasons, we have this tendency to avoid facing the hard questions. Well, what we're trying to do in this series is to face them together and to process through them, to create some space for us to wrestle with these questions, because we really do believe that there are good, real, clear, though sometimes difficult answers to these questions. And the question that we're looking at this morning is this: is Christianity too narrow? You can go ahead and put that first slide. Is Christianity too narrow? Which is kind of a strange question, at least in the way that it's asked, because it can be interpreted in a couple different ways. What the question is really getting at, and you can probably already get it based off of the video, is it's really the question is Christianity too exclusive? And what we have to acknowledge up front is this: Christianity is absolutely exclusive. You can't get around it. I know there's people who try to get around it. I know there's churches that try to get around it and make it seem like, it's just one of the many good options are out there. But Jesus, who at the end of the day is at the very heart of Christianity, you don't have Christianity without Jesus. Jesus, in John chapter 14, I think this is one of the most well-known verses in regards to this question about exclusivity, puts it this way. You put that up on the screen for me. Here's what he says. He says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. He doesn't say I'm one of the ways. He doesn't say I'm one good option among many other good options. He says, I am the truth among a world full of lies. There is, listen, and by the way, if there's any lack of clarity on what Jesus is saying, he says, no one comes to the Father but through me. In other words, Jesus is very clearly saying, if you want a relationship with God, the only way that that's possible is through me. There's only one option. There's not many ways. There's one way. There's not many truths. There's one truth. There's only one way to life. Jesus says that's through him. So definitely the answer to whether or not Christianity is exclusive is definitive. The answer is yes, Christianity claims to be the only way to God. But the question isn't, is Christianity exclusive? The question is it wrong that it's exclusive? And that's where people start to wrestle. We wrestle with this idea that how can we say that there's one right way and that all the other ways are wrong? Shouldn't we be more inclusive and say that, sure, I have a truth, but so you have a truth as well, and so all, we all have these forms of truth. The question that I want us to think about this morning is this: why do we struggle? If God says there's one way, why do we wrestle with that? Why is that? If God says, I'm going to provide one way to myself, this is the way, what's the real problem? And let me just put it in a different context for a moment. Let's take it out of this idea of God for a moment. Let's put it in terms of your health. Let's imagine that you find out that you have cancer. And some of you have dealt with this, some of you are dealing with this right now, but let's say you find out you have cancer. Israeli scientists have just said this week they're 1 year out from finding a cure to cancer. Now, people are debating whether or not that's true or not, but that's what they're saying. So let's imagine, end of this year, these Israeli scientists have found the cure for cancer. And the doctor comes to you and says, you have one option. You can certainly go and take any medicine that you want, but none of that medicine is going to cure this cancer. But this one medicine, if you take it, it will cure you. At that moment, will you be angry that the doctor has given you one option instead of many options? Or will you be thankful that there is clearly a one cure that if you take it, cancer's gone? Now, we know that doesn't exist right now, but I'm just hypothetically speaking. Would you be angry that you can't have all the options, or celebrating the fact that there's actually an option for you to get better? And I think the answer is really clear. The answer is, at least for me, I'd be celebrating there's a cure to cancer. I can get better if I take this medicine. I wouldn't be going, why can't I just take that other medicine that I really like and get better from that? I'd be celebrating this one medicine. So the question is, if we would be willing to accept the exclusivity of a medicine that would cure us, why is it that we struggle with the exclusivity of a God that says, I'm only providing one way, and this is the way? And I believe the answer really comes down to a deeper question. Now, we're going to come back to the question of exclusivity and how can there only be one way to God next week, because I think that there is a deeper question underlying our problem with the exclusivity of God. And the problem is this. If we were to ask the question differently, here's how I think we would ask it. Why can't I go to God any way that I want? And see, that question is really not dealing with exclusivity. It's dealing with our cultural definition of freedom. It's really a problem of freedom. I should be able to. Why are you limiting me? Why are you saying that I really don't have the freedom to choose any way that I want? Why are you telling me I only have this one way of doing it? See, because the cultural definition of freedom, over time, the definition of freedom has changed. One author puts it this way: freedom has come to be defined, and that phrase "come to be defined" is very important as we think about this issue of freedom this morning, because over time, the word freedom and our understanding of it has changed. Freedom today is not what we once defined it as. It's become something different. And that happens with words all of the time. There are words we use today that mean different things than the way we used to use them before. But in this case, it's a problem. Because freedom, he says, has come to be defined as the absence of any limitations or constraints on us. By this definition, the fewer boundaries we have on our choices and actions, the freer we feel ourselves to be. In other words, if I'm going to define it in the most simplest terms as the way our culture sees it, and by the way I think we, even as Christians, if you're a Christian this morning, we struggle with seeing it this way as well. We think of freedom as being able to do what I want whenever I want to do it. If I can do what I want whenever I want it, then I'm really free. And by the way, this way of defining freedom started back when we were kids. Because think about it. I mean, how many of us, when we were teenagers, we said, I can't wait to get out of mom and dad's house? Now, why did you say? If you said that, or you had a friend that said that, why? What was it that you wanted to get out? Nobody said, I can't wait to get out of mom and dad's houses so I can go and pay taxes. Nobody said, I want to get out of mom and dad's house so I can get into the daily grind of having a job and all the responsibilities that come with that, and paying all the bills and supporting myself and making my own meals and cleaning my own stuff up. I can't wait for all of that. Nobody says, I want to get out of mom and dad's house for those reasons. Why did we say it? Because I'll be honest with you, I said it. I grew up, my dad was a state police officer. I grew up in a house with lots of rules. And you knew when you broke them. And so there was this idea that, well, what I want is I want to get out from under those rules. I want to get out from an authority over me telling me how to live my life so that I can go and be free. There's a movie back, I think it was in 2004, called I, Robot. In the movie, there's a robot, artificial intelligence, who's been created for a specific design for a purpose. And at the end of the movie, he's fulfilled his purpose, and he's having a conversation with the human main character in the movie. And the robot, his name is Sonny, says to the other character, Detective Spooner, he says, now that I've fulfilled my purpose, I don't know what to do. And Detective Spooner responds and he says, I guess you'll have to find your way like the rest of us, Sonny. That's what it means to be free. No one's telling you how to live your life. No one's telling you what you have to do. No one is an authority over you. See, freedom in our culture is an autonomy from any authority. It's the ability to live my life any way that I want it. And in that context of our understanding of freedom, you need to understand that means Christianity is the enemy. The enemy of freedom, at least. If we understand freedom as the ability to do whatever we want whenever we want it, then we look at Christianity and we say, it seems to me that Christianity doesn't give freedom, it takes it away. If we're really honest about it. And see, that's what I think the real problem of this question of exclusivity roots itself in. Certainly, I think the issue of all the other options out there and why is that religion wrong and this religion is wrong and this religion is right, and we'll talk about that next week. But I think that there's this underlying issue where Christianity feels like an enemy of our freedom and our ability to live our lives the way we really want to live them. In fact, in Tim Keller's book, Making Sense of God, he writes an account about a man by the name of Mark Leah, a professor, a Columbia professor who wrote a New York Times Magazine article. And in it, he writes about meeting a man who had graduated from the prestigious Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania. And he discovered to his shock that this man of great intelligence had one day walked the aisle at a Billy Graham crusade and had been born again. Keller writes, Lilla as a teenager had flirted with Christianity, but then he found the place in the Bible where Jesus tells Nicodemus, an accomplished scholar and leader, you must be born again. Lilla wrote, Jesus seems to be telling Nicodemus that he must recognize his own insufficiency and that he will have to turn his back on his autonomous, seemingly happy life and be reborn as a human being who understands his dependency on something greater. And then listen to his conclusion. That seems like a radical challenge to our freedom, and it is. He goes on to say that that's the reason that he couldn't follow Jesus. See, I think the underlying question is really this: do I have to choose between freedom and faith? And what I'll tell you, I'll give you the answer up front, because I think that's really the question that Jesus is addressing in the passage that we're looking at today. And the question is this: yes and no. If you follow Jesus, does that mean that you have to give up your freedom? Is that true? Well, it's true and it's false, and I'm going to explain. It sounds like I'm not committing to an answer, but the actuality is I'm committing to the answer, and I'll explain it to you as we look at the passage together this morning. Would you stand with me? Let me pray for us, and then I'm going to read the passage that we're looking at. We're going to start in verse 31 in just a moment. Let me pray. Father God, I thank you so much for being able to come here together and to share from your word. God, I pray that this message would spur conversations and discussions and thinking about what freedom really means. Jesus, you very clearly claim to be the way, the truth, and the life. And your call on our lives is one of surrender. It's giving up the control of our lives to you. That's why your invitation it's not just an assent to information. Your invitation is for us to follow you. Lord, to follow you, we have to give up control. And the truth is we struggle with that because we've bought into the idea that freedom means being in control of our own lives. And so, Lord, this morning as we come here, and Father, my belief is that we all wrestle with this in some way, shape, or form. We have places in our hearts and our lives that we've held back, that we have tried to maintain that sense of control because we believe that that's the way we're actually free. And so, God, I pray this morning that you would teach us from your word, that we would be willing to listen and not harden our hearts, as some certainly choose to do along the way. Thank you for your word. In Jesus' name, amen. So we're in verse 31, John chapter 8, verse 31. So Jesus said to the Jews who had believed in him, if you abide in my word, you are truly my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. They answered him, we are offspring of Abraham and have never been enslaved to anyone. How is it that you say you will become free? Jesus answered them, truly, truly, I say to you, everyone who commits sin is a slave to sin. The slave does not remain in the house forever. The son remains forever. So if the son sets you free, you will be free indeed. This is God's word. You can go ahead and be seated. So what Jesus is really getting at in this passage, and what he's really addressing, is this cultural definition of freedom and our misunderstanding of reality. That's really what he's dealing with. And so I have 4 points that I just want to walk through with you that I see in this passage, and each one of them is going to sound very strange if we look at it through the lens of our cultural definition of freedom. But what Jesus is challenging us with is to get a re-understanding of what freedom really is. And so here's point number one. Freedom, true freedom, means I have to choose my limitations. Freedom isn't as simple. You see, this definition of freedom as being able to do whatever I want whenever I want. It is an oversimplified definition, and it is an oversimplified view of reality. And it's what these men have who Jesus is he's talking with, because he says to them, he's talking to them about being free. He says, if you, and you will, verse 32, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. And the response is, what are you talking about freedom for? Because the reality is that we've never been slaves. Nothing controls us. We have the ability to do, they're living by the cultural, worldly definition of freedom, which says freedom is being able to do whatever I want, whenever I want. And they're saying, well, nothing controls us. And Jesus' response is, if you actually think that's true, you are living by an illusion, because no one has the ability to do what they want whenever they want. No one. Not truly. If you understand reality. And here's why. Because you and I live in a world of competing wants in ourselves. Right? There are things that you want, say, want A, and there are other things that you want B. And the truth is that you can't have both A and B. You have to choose between one or the other, which means not only if you want A, the freedom of A, then you have to accept the limitations of not having B. But if you want B, then you have to accept the limitations of not having A in order to experience the freedom of that, which means at the end of the day, freedom isn't just choosing the ability to do something, it is also embracing the ability to not do something or to not have something. And that may sound very confusing, but let me illustrate it for you in two ways. Number one, a number of years ago, my health was at the bottom of the barrel. I was 50 pounds heavier. I was in constant pain. The pain was so severe that I couldn't sleep at night. So I was on medicine for pain, and then I was on medicine for sleeping. My back would just give out any time that I tried to do anything physical. This is at a stage of life where I had young boys who wanted to be able to wrestle and play on the floor and do things like play Thomas the Tank Engine trains, which required, you'd think, well, that doesn't require that all that much. But for me, it was nearly impossible because being on the floor created so much pain. In fact, there was a season that I went through, actually, where I couldn't sleep on any cushions. The only place that I could ever fall asleep was sleeping on a hard floor. So I was on medicine for pain. I was on medicine for sleeping. On top of that, I was on medicine for depression and anxiety. I think that makes a little bit of sense when you're going through all of those things. I was on all sorts of medicine. Just walking upstairs, I would get out of breath. I was exhausted. I was in and out of doctor's offices, in and out of the hospital. I was in the emergency room pretty consistently. I think they actually got to know me pretty well in those days. And one day I found myself in a doctor's office because I just was searching for answers, and nobody had any answers. They just kept throwing more pills at me, throwing more pills at me, throwing more pills at me. And I was sitting in this doctor's office waiting for someone to walk into the room, and a nurse walks in. And she begins to ask me questions about what was going on. And as I was sharing those things with her, I got done, it was a long story. Lots of details. I got done and she said, well, the doctor's going to be in a moment and he'll have suggestions and ideas as to what to do next. She said, but I'm going to make a suggestion, and I'm the nurse, but you do with it what you will, but I think that you have a problem with your food. Not just that you eat too much, though I certainly did that. But I think you have food allergies that are leading to all these problems that you have. And I think you need to go on a diet. And she said, I don't mean like a couple months of a diet or a few weeks or whatever it is. I mean, you need to radically change your diet if you're going to get better. And I said, well, what do you mean change my diet? And she said, I think you need to cut two things from your diet, just to start with. I think you need to cut gluten out of your diet, and I think you need to cut dairy out of your diet. And I know everybody has lots of strong opinions about those things. But, that if she had said that to me even a year before that point, I probably would have laughed at her because that was my diet. Like gluten and dairy, I sprinkled it on everything that I possibly could. It was like, gluten is in your breads, gluten is in your pastas, which again, those are my two, primary food sources at that point. And then add dairy onto that. What you're saying is, I can never eat pizza again, love pizza, but I can't ever eat pizza again. Good pizza. Not only can I not eat pizza again, but you crossing out at that point in time basically all desserts, all of the things that you enjoy to eat, which, by the way, I've gotten to the point where I've had to cut most of the spices out of my diet, which means everything that I eat is bland. If you want to know what to make for me, make something bland. That's where my diet, she was saying, that's where your diet has to go. And so what she's saying in that moment is this: you want to be able to eat whatever you want whenever you want it, but you also want to be able to play on the floor with your boys and be healthy and have an existence outside of what you're living right now. The truth is you can't have both of those things. If you're going to have the freedom of being on the floor and playing with your boys, then you have to embrace the limitations of not eating the kinds of food that you're eating. But if you want to certainly choose to eat whatever food you want to eat, you can embrace that freedom, but you have to accept the limitations of not playing on the floor with your boys. And that day, I walked out of the office, and my wife will confirm this. I called her immediately and said, I will never eat gluten or dairy again. Why? Because what I was saying, now that wasn't completely true. I'm going to talk, there's times where I dip back into the gluten and dairy, but I pay for it every time. But listen, what I was saying in that moment was the freedom that is most important to me is the freedom to be healthy and to have the kind of life of being able to be with my boys and play with my boys and wrestle with my boys and play basketball with my boys and play Thomas the Tank Engine with my boys on the floor. That's the freedom that I want, which means I have to embrace this limitation of not eating these kind of foods. It's not as simple as saying, just get rid of limitations so you can be free. That's not the way the world exists. Put it in the context of an intimate relationship. If you are going to have not just a casual relationship, I'm talking about a deep, growing, intimate relationship, you can only experience that if you embrace limitations. I remember a couple coming in and sitting with me in premarital counseling, and the subject that day was communication. It's always a fun day. And the soon-to-be wife was very upset. She was angry, actually, as we began to talk about it. And I said, tell me, what are you upset about? And she said, here's what I'm upset about. He, speaking about her fiance, he just goes and does whatever he wants whenever he wants to do it and doesn't tell me. He just disappears. He goes someplace. He doesn't tell me where he's going. He doesn't tell me when he's coming back, and I call him, and I text him, and he doesn't call me, he doesn't text me, there's no communication, and if he wants to be married to me, that's going to have to change. And she was absolutely right. See, here's a guy who's saying, I want the intimacy of marriage, but I want the freedom of being a bachelor. And you've got two wants that are competing against each other, and you can't have both. Freedom is not the absence of limitations. Here's what it is. Listen, I'll read this to you. Freedom is not, one writer puts it this way, freedom is not what the culture tells us. Real freedom comes from the strategic loss of some freedoms in order to gain others. It is not the absence of constraints, but it is choosing the right constraints and the right freedoms to lose. It is not the absence of authority. It is not the absence of structure. It is not the absence of rules. It is actually the presence of the right rules, which is exactly what Jesus is trying to guide these people to help them to understand what it is that he's calling them to. And if you want to know, the obvious next question is, well, how do you know what the right limitations are to embrace? And the answer is this, it's point number 2. Real freedom means understanding and embracing the limitations of your design. It's how your life has been designed. It's how it's been shaped. If you live outside of your design, you will not be free. Not truly free. I've shared this story before. You might remember, but when my brother was a young boy, one day he was up on the second floor of our house in his bedroom, and my mom was on the bottom floor of the house. And she heard rhythmic banging upstairs. And so she ran upstairs to find out what in the world is going on, and she found my older brother on his radiator. We were upstate New York, and so we had the old school radiators, and he's up on the radiator with his window open, and he is rhythmically slamming himself against the screen in the window with a towel that had been tied around his neck. And the reason that he was doing that was because he wanted to fly. Now, we're all logical adults here in the room, so we understand that the physical design of our bodies is not in such a way that we were created to fly. If you do not embrace the limitations of the design of your body, you do not find greater freedom, you find the loss of freedom. If he jumped out the window that day, most likely he would have died. At the very least, he would have broken a whole lot of bones and found himself not free at all. Think of it like a fish. When I was a young boy, I had a 10-gallon tank in my bedroom, and I went out and I bought a swordtail fish. Swordtail fish, it was an orange fish with a black tail that had a long fin off of the bottom of it. And as a young boy, I was excited about having this fish. I put it in the tank, and sometime later, I came back to check on this fish, and it was gone. I couldn't find it anywhere. Now, I had a lid on the tank, but the back of it was wide open, and I'm searching for this fish, couldn't find it anywhere. No idea what had happened. And sometime later when I was cleaning my room, which was a rare occurrence, I was cleaning my room and I went down and was cleaning under the fish tank, and there under the fish tank was my swordtail fish, which had dried and gotten crusty and died. Why? Because it did not embrace the limitations of its design. The fish decided that it would try jumping out of the water instead of staying in the water. And the result was not more freedom, the result was death. The result was a loss of freedom. See, it's not so simple to say, you know what freedom is? Freedom is getting rid of your limitations. Freedom is not the absence of your limitations. You want to know what freedom is? Freedom is the environment that enables you to thrive as you were created to be. Freedom is the environment that facilitates you living the life that you were made to live. If you don't embrace that design, you lose the ability to actually fulfill what it is you were made to do. I think of it as just as simple as a ship, a sailboat. If you see a sailboat moving along the water, sailing swiftly across Lake Michigan whenever that thaws, you recognize that the only reason it's able to do that is because the captain of that ship, of that boat, embraced the limitations of the design of the boat. And the limitation of the design of the boat is that it was made to sail in deeper waters. If he tries to bring it into shallow water or up on land, suddenly it stops working. Freedom is not the absence of limitations. Freedom is the embracing of the right limitations, which is exactly what Jesus is driving to, which is what point 3 leads us. Here's point number 3 of what Jesus is saying is this. See, there are certain ways of living that lead to the loss of freedom. See, to say freedom is being able to live however I want, whenever I want it, just turn on the news any day of the week, and you will find people who have embraced that message of freedom. They have said, here's how you can be free. Do what you want whenever you want, and the result is not freedom, the result is prison. The result is that they go to jail because they decided that they would live outside of their design. They bought into the definition of freedom, the cultural definition of freedom, and what Jesus is saying in this moment is it's built on a lie, and that lie is at the very heart of sin. They say, we've never been free, and he says, that's an illusion. If you think that you're in control, that is an illusion, because no one is truly, fully in control of their lives. The reality is that you and I were created to live for something. You were designed with a need to find your significance, your satisfaction, and your security outside of yourself. In fact, if you try to find those things in yourself, it will never be sufficient. You will necessarily have to look to something else. Let's just use significance for a moment. You can look in the mirror all day long and say, I'm good enough, I'm smart enough, and doggone it, people like me. But it will never be enough to satisfy the longing of significance, because do you know what you need? You need someone outside of yourself that says, that's true. You need it. And see, whatever you look to for that, ultimately, it will control your life. And if you're not looking to God, which is what sin is a life disconnected from God. And the lie of sin says this: if you disconnect from God, if you disconnect from His authority, if you go off and you do things your way, you'll find freedom. And it's a lie, because what sin does is it twists the whole thing. It promises that it will give you freedom, but in the end, what Jesus is saying is it turns around and controls you. When you live a life disconnected from God, you have to look to something else for those three things: significance, security, and satisfaction. You have to find them somewhere else, and if you're not looking to God, you're looking to something else in this world, which is the way that most people live their lives. We look to things like our work. We look to things like our relationships. We look to things like money. We look to things like affirmation. We look to things like possession. You have to look to something, and if you're not looking to God, you're looking to something in the world, and whatever you look to, it ultimately controls you. And if it's not good, if it's not God, it's not good. But if it's not God, it will turn around, and when it controls you, it will crush you. It doesn't give you more freedom, it actually robs you of it. David Foster Wallace, who is a postmodern novelist, I don't believe that he is a Christian, but he puts it in a way that I think makes it very clear what it is that Jesus is getting at anyway. He says this, in the day-to-day trenches of adult life, there is no such thing as not worshiping. And we talk about worshiping. That's the context in which we look to something for that significance, security, satisfaction. Again, whatever you look to is what controls you. Whatever you worship is what controls you. He says, there's no such thing as not worshiping. Everybody worships. Everybody's looking to something. The only choice we get is what we worship. And an outstanding reason for choosing some sort of God or spiritual thing to worship, hence the reason I say I don't think he's a Christian, the outstanding reason for looking to something, some God or spiritual thing, is that pretty much anything else you worship will eat you alive. If you worship money and things, if they are where you tap real meaning in life, then you will never have enough. Never feel you have enough. Worship your own body and beauty and sexual allure, and you will always feel ugly. And when time and age start showing, you will die a million deaths before they finally plant you. Worship power. You will end up feeling weak and afraid, and you will need ever more power over others to keep the fear at bay. Worship your intellect and being seen as smart, and you will end up feeling stupid, a fraud, always on the verge of being found out. He's saying at the end of the day, anything that you look to in the world, you think it's going to bring you freedom. You will think it will bring you security, significance, or satisfaction, but at the end of the day, it turns around and it steals it all. I think the best illustration that we can use to think of this is addiction. And some of us in the room have experienced this. And the substance that I'll use to describe this is alcohol. Think about how they sell alcohol. Today is a Super Bowl. So if you're watching the Super Bowl, you'll see a plethora of ads for Budweiser and whatever else, right? And how do they sell it? Right? There's no ads with somebody who is overweight, with an overgrown stubble, who looks depressed and discouraged with empty cans around them. They sell it by showing you beautiful people who are having fun, enjoying life. And what's the message? If you do this, you will find freedom. I mean, that's the idea of it. It will release your inhibitions. You'll be able to really be yourself and enjoy life and have fun. That's the whole way that they sell it. But see, the danger is that over time, the more you drink, the more you need to feel that. Right? And the more you drink as a result of that, see, there's a subtle shift that happens along the way, and some of you know exactly. It's almost imperceivable to the person who's experiencing it. And alcohol is just one illustration of many, many things that control our lives. But there's a subtle shift that happens somewhere along the way that you go from being in control to suddenly being controlled, from wanting to drink to needing it, to the point where you cannot live without it. And Jesus says, do you understand that's what happens? There are ways that you live that actually take your freedom away. And when you disconnect from God, you are not actually putting yourself in control. You put something else in control, and everything other than God ultimately will not give you freedom. It will steal it from you. And so Jesus comes along and he says, here's point number 4. True freedom comes by giving control to the right thing. You have to embrace the right limitations, and you are always ultimately giving control to something. If you want to be free, you have to give up control to the right thing. And that sounds crazy to our ears, but the truth is it's everything that we've seen. If I was going to be free, I had to give up the control of my food. If a captain is going to sail the sailboat, he has to give up that control of being able to go wherever he wants and to actually follow according to the design. If the fish is going to live, it had to give up the control of being free to jump out of the water. It certainly had the freedom to do it, obviously. But if he was going to thrive, it had to choose to stay inside the water, to give up control to the right design and to the right thing. And Jesus comes along, and what does he say? He says to these men, look again at it, verse 31. So Jesus said to the Jews who had believed him, if you abide in my word, you are truly my disciples. That word abide means live in and live by. He says, I'm giving you my word, and if you do my word, if you live in my word, and you live by my word, that's what it means to be a disciple of Jesus. A disciple of Jesus is not just somebody who has sense to information. A disciple of Jesus is someone who has given up control of their life and surrendered that to Jesus Christ himself. That's what it means to be a disciple. Make no mistake of that. And he says, but here's the good news. Yes, so the question is, if I believe in Jesus, does that mean I have to give up control? The answer is yes. Do I give up freedom? Yes, but no. Why? Because what he says next, then you will know, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. What Jesus is saying in this moment, he's saying, I'm the environment of freedom. I'm the one that if you give control to me, I enable you to thrive. Why? Because here's what Jesus is saying. I never call you to do anything. I never give you a limitation that is not in line with your design. If I say no to that, if I say, no, you have to embrace this limitation, it's not because I'm keeping you from something, it's that I'm saving you for something. I'm not giving you some list of arbitrary rules that are meaningless. I'm actually telling you, this is the fish tank that you're supposed to stay in. If you jump out of this, then you die. But if you stay in this is how you live. Jesus says, I'm the one for that. Jonathan Edwards, who's very well known, by the way, for his pastor in the 1700s who preached a sermon called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. In another sermon, he says it this way. He says, what could the most merciful being have done for our encouragement? All that he desires of us is that we would not be miserable, that we would not follow those courses which of themselves would end in misery, and that we would be happy. God, having a great desire to speak after the manner of man, that we should not be miserable but happy, has the mercy and goodness that he forwards us to it, to command us to do those things that will make us so. Should we not think him a prince of extraordinary clemency, he a master of extraordinary goodness, he a father of great tenderness, who never commanded anything of his subjects, his servants, or his children, but that what was for their good and advantage? But God is such a king, such a Lord, such a father for us. Is Christianity exclusive? Yes, it is. Does Jesus say, if you want to follow me, you have to give up control? Yes, he does. And by the way, that is the invitation of Christianity. The invitation of Christianity is not just a mere intellectual assent to a set of information. It is into a relationship with a Lord, a king, a ruler who says, I am the authority, follow after me. If you play the game of follow the leader, you have to, if you're going to actually play it, give up control to the leader. And in this moment, Jesus says, I'm the leader. Yes, you have to give up freedoms, but when you do, you don't find yourself less free. You find yourself free, truly free, because you live out the design that you were made for. And the question that we ask is, but how do we know that that's true? How can we believe that? And my answer to you is this, because of how the Son sets you free. Jesus says, if the Son sets you free, you're free indeed. Do you understand how Jesus sets you free? See, every other religion in the world says you move first. Every other religion in the world says you give up your freedom and then maybe God will save you. You give up your freedom and then if you give it up well enough, maybe God will rescue you. But you're first. But you know what the gospel says? In the gospel, God says, me first. Because the message of the gospel is this, that Jesus Christ, the Son of God, stepped from heaven and embraced limitation for you. That he took on flesh and blood, and he was born as a baby. You don't get more limited than that. He was born as an infant, and he grew up to be a man who was rejected and allowed himself to be taken, to be laid out and nailed to a cross and to be raised up, and to experience the loss of that, to experience true limitation as he embraced our sin and the punishment that we deserved. For what reason? So that you and I could be saved from slavery. So that you and I could be set free from sin and death forever and ever and ever. And if he would do that for you, can you not trust him when he says, surrender to me? Today I'll give you just two invitations as I close. The first is this. The first step of surrendering that control is to actually believe in him. to trust him and say, you know what, I believe, Jesus, I'm giving my life to you. And see, some of you have been flirting with Jesus. Some of you have been playing games with him. You've been around him, but you've never taken that first step. You've never really said, my life belongs to you. And his invitation today is to come. He comes to you and says, listen, I came to make you free. And yes, that means you have to surrender control, but you can trust me. And the question you have to ask is, am I willing to trust him today? Am I willing to say, my life belongs to you? And are you willing to give up control to him? To believe in him? That's what it really means to believe in Jesus. Is that you're saying, I trust you. I believe in you as my Savior and King. And therefore I'm giving up control. That's the invitation to you today if you've never taken that step. But to those of us who have taken that step, and by the way, if you want to talk through that, I would love to talk with you and pray with you. There's no special hoops to jump through. There's no special rituals. It is a transfer of your trust from something else to Jesus and the surrender of your life to him. And I'm happy to talk through that with you, but for those of us who've already taken that step, I want to challenge you with this. I believe every one of us in this room, somewhere along the way, is still wrestling with that whole issue of control, because somewhere we're still buying into the lie that freedom is me being able to do whatever I want whenever I want it. Larry Crabb, in his introduction to the book, Pleasures Evermore by Sam Storms, says it this way: too many Christians struggle against sinful passions, which we should do, by running from all passions, which we shouldn't do. We're like children who grudgingly eat our spinach of obedience, hoping someday we'll receive a cookie. The only hope for experiencing meaningful victory over sin is to live for a greater pleasure. There are pleasures in sin for a season, but they turn sour always, eventually. There are true pleasures in holiness for a lifetime, and they never turn sour. If you have places in your life where you've been refusing to give up control, Jesus' invitation is still the same to you, and here's what it is: follow him.